The stale scent of last night's regrets, a bitter cocktail of stale beer and forgotten hopes, hung heavy in the air of the decrepit bar. It clung to the worn velvet of the booths, permeated the sticky surface of the counter, and seemed to cling to the very soul of the place. Well past closing time, Joe, a man whose face was etched with the weary lines of 1,000 bad decisions and countless lonely nights, hunched over a solitary bar stool at the far end of the establishment. Before him, an array of half-empty bottles, their labels faded and streaked, glinted in the dim, unforgiving light, their contents reflected endlessly in the grimy mirror behind the bar. Joe's gaze, clouded and unfocused, fixed on his own reflection, a spectral image staring back from the alcohol-stained glass.
Forever.
He rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper that barely managed to cut through the oppressive silence that had settled over the bar.
Is a long damn time. Why not? Why not me? One more for the road, I suppose.
His hand, gnarled and trembling slightly, reached out, not for a glass, but for the full bottle of amber liquid. The clinking of glass against glass was the only sound.
I've become intimately acquainted with forever lately. Its echo, you see, it keeps me company through the long nights. Always there whispering, "Take it. It's yours. Take the whole pack."
He pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his pocket, the tobacco smell mingling with the pervasive odor of stale liquor. He stared at them with a mixture of desperate longing and profound disgust, a silent battle playing out in his bloodshot eyes, before shoving them with surprising force across the polished, though sticky, bar to the solitary figure, wiping down glasses.
Damn cigarettes. Don't need 'em, don't want 'em. Been a love-hate thing, that. Story of my life, really.
He paused, his gaze drifting back to his own reflection, a ghost in the glass.
Really. The guy across the bar, he's a lot like me. Uneasy, anxious but worn, dusted, faded and out of style, like this here damn jacket. And probably holding on to more than it should.
The bartender, a weary man named Frank, whose perpetually tired expression suggested a lifetime of enduring similar soliloquies, didn't even bother to look up. He merely continued his monotonous task of wiping down the counter, the faint scent of disinfectant briefly cutting through the heavier air.
Buddy.
Frank's voice was flat, devoid of emotion.
You're the only other person in here.
Joe simply waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away an annoying fly or a bothersome thought. He ignored Frank's comment entirely, his mind already caught in the currents of his own self-pity.
Rarely see eye to eye with anyone.
He continued, as if speaking to an invisible confidant.
Jack Daniels. He's the only one a guy like me can trust. The only one who truly understands. And maybe, just maybe, he can get me through this one. This predicament.
I don't know, pal.
Frank sighed, a sound of profound weariness. He glanced at the clock above the liquor shelf.
But we're closing up soon.
Joe leaned forward, his bloodshot eyes trying to lock onto Frank's, an attempt at connection in the desolate landscape of his mind.
So how's life been treating you? Any good hands lately?
Frank just shook his head slowly, a silent testament to years of dealing with the meandering ramblings of late-night drinkers. He continued wiping the bar, the rhythmic swish of the cloth the only sound now, a slow, methodical scrubbing that seemed to erase both spills and sins.
Sure, just great.
Joe muttered, taking another long swig directly from the bottle, the amber liquid gurgling as it disappeared.
Better than me, I'll bet. Forever's a damn long time, huh, pal? You see, up until recent weeks, I've cared little for the word forever, or even this very bottle, you see. I played a straight hand, no fixes, no marked cards, just the cards I was dealt. And I played them clean, or so I thought.
He gestured vaguely with the bottle.
A man of integrity, you might say.
I'm going in the back to clean things up.
Frank announced, grabbing a bucket and a mop, the clanking of the metal adding a harsh counterpoint to Joe's monologue. His voice, though still calm, held a new edge of finality.
You better be gone when I get back. And I mean it this time.
Joe chuckled humorlessly, a dry, rasping sound.
He doesn't mean it. Just blowing off steam. I practically run this place. Been coming here for, well, come to think of it, I don't know. Frank wouldn't dare kick out a loyal customer like me.
He took another gulp, the liquor burning a familiar, comforting path down his throat, momentarily dulling the raw edge of his thoughts.
No, I know. I've done wrong, but what, if anything, has ever truly gone my way? Not your way, or the guy next to you, or the neighbor across the street with his perfect lawn, or even the guy you buy the $20 gin from on lonely nights. No, I mean my way. Is that selfish? To want things to align with my own design, my own desires? I think, on the contrary, it's only human.
Frank reappeared, the distant clatter of bottles from the back room replaced by the menacing gleam in his eyes. He saw Joe still muttering to his reflection, lost in his self-pitying reverie, the bottle now nearly empty. With a sudden surge of long-suppressed frustration and exhaustion, Frank moved around the bar and, without a word, began to forcefully usher Joe towards the door. Joe, caught off guard and already off balance from the alcohol, stumbled, but his ranting continued, his voice rising in volume, a desperate plea to the uncaring night.
A natural yearning. I feel, well, you know how I feel? Don't you see it in my eyes, in this mirror, in every damn reflection?
Frank's patience finally snapped.
I don't care, buddy, not one bit. Just get the hell out of here, now.
He shoved him harder, pushing him through the creaking doorframe, the night air, cool and indifferent, rushing in.
Jealousy, hatred, pity, I suppose. All at the same time. It's a toxic brew, toxic. I guess it all comes down to this, fate. That fickle mistress. And if my way never gains light, if it never sees the dawn, and was never sought for the seeking, never grasped and obtained, or was it merely a phantom, a whisper in the dark, a lie I told myself? That's probably it. Well then, it wasn't meant to be.
With a final desperate shove, Frank propelled Joe out onto the dimly lit street corner. Joe landed awkwardly, his already scuffed knee scraping against the rough pavement with a dull thud. He lay there for a moment, the dull ache in his joint, a distant echo of the deeper, more profound pain that gnawed at his core. The neon glow of a distant sign flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows around him. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a fresh pack of cigarettes, the ones he'd claimed he didn't want, and lit one with a trembling hand, the sudden flare of the match briefly illuminating the raw despair in his eyes. He took a long, shuddering drag, the harsh smoke burning his lungs, a fleeting comfort. Then he turned his gaze, not to the indifferent street, but to the unseen audience, a bitter, knowing smirk playing on his lips, a final performance for an empty house. The smoke curled around his face, obscuring him, leaving only the chilling echo of his words in the silent night. The perpetual twilight of the town clung to Joe, dim and oppressive. It wasn't quite night, not quite day, but a purgatorial dusk that stretched on endlessly. Joe, a man eternally caught in the amber glow of the city's neon signs, shuffled from one establishment to another, a landscape of faded brick and worn sidewalks. He was a stranger, yet fixture to the handful of people who populated this curious half-light. He'd talk to anyone who'd listen, or anyone who couldn't escape him. The weary bartenders who perpetually wiped down the same sticky surfaces, the tired owners of the 24-hour diners where coffee cups were endlessly refilled. He'd talk about anything and everything. He'd reminisce about old songs, complain about the price of cigarettes, ponder the meaning of a life that felt like a scratched record, playing the same track on repeat. Yet through it all, there was an unspoken question in his eyes, a desperate longing that no amount of liquor or small talk could quite mask. He was there, yet not quite present, an observer in his own unraveling story. Tonight, Joe found himself drawn into the dusty embrace of the Curio Corner, a shop crammed with forgotten treasures and oddities that seemed to collect shadows in their depths. The scent of old wood and forgotten memories hung in the air, a peculiar comfort. Behind a counter piled high with tarnished silver and yellowed postcards sat Arthur, the owner. Arthur was a man as old and weathered as his wares. His eyes, though rheumy, held a surprising depth, as if they'd witnessed centuries unfold. Joe leaned against a display case filled with chipped porcelain dolls, their vacant stares unsettling in the dim light. "Rough night, Arthur," he spurred out, though the hour was as ambiguous as ever. "Seems like every night's a rough one in this town." Arthur, who had been meticulously polishing a brass telescope that looked like it had seen distant stars, paused. He set the cloth down, his gaze settling on Joe with an unnerving clarity. "Some nights are rougher than others, Joe. And some nights just don't end." Joe grunted, a cynical laugh escaping his lips. "Tell me about it." "Been trying to catch some decent shut-eye for what feels like an eternity." Arthur slowly pushed a dusty ledger across the counter, its pages filled with elegant, antiquated script. He didn't look at Joe, but his voice was low, as if sharing a profound secret. "How funny. How's the rash, Joe?" Joe blinked, the alcohol-induced haze momentarily parting. "My rash? What in blazes are you talking about, Arthur?" Arthur finally met Joe's gaze, his ancient eyes piercing and surprisingly direct. "Ah, nothing." He tapped a gnarled finger on the open ledger. "We're well just going through motions, but it helps, don't you think? Something truly remarkable about ignorance. But you, Joe, you're your own thing altogether. We've all been here a long time. But the last Joe felt a shiver trace its way down his spine, a cold knot forming in the pit of his stomach. He looked around the dusty shop, at the silent, watchful objects, then back at Arthur's unblinking stare. The perpetual twilight outside seemed to press in closer, the air suddenly thick with unseen meaning. He still didn't understand, not really, but the words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, like a promise or a sentence. The last? Now Joe was a familiar phantom in this strange, for lack of better term, interim, a man of a remaining few, condemned to shuffle between the sticky bar stools of decrepit watering holes and the fluorescent glow of all-night diners. Eventually Joe's conversations were less about connection and more about grasping at the frayed ends of meaning in a world that offered none, a constant low-grade fever dream from which he couldn't wake. After his unnerving encounter with Arthur at the Curio Corner, a fresh layer of unease had settled over Joe. The shop's peculiar scent of forgotten things now seemed to carry a subtle, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers or long-buried secrets, finally rising to the surface. He'd tried to shake Arthur's words, to dismiss the old man as just another eccentric swallowed by this strange city, but they clung to him, heavy and insistent. Now he found himself, as always, at his usual perch at the end of the bar, the mirror reflecting his gaunt face back at him with an unnerving clarity. He stared, not at his own reflection, but through it, as if seeking an answer. The bartender, Frank, was conspicuously absent tonight, replaced by a younger man with a perpetually bored expression and a wilting rose tattooed on his forearm. This new face, like all the others, seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, perpetually going through the motions.
You ever get the feeling you're waiting for something? Something big, something fundamental, but you don't know what it is or why.
The young bartender barely grunted in response, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point as he mindlessly wiped down a glass.
Just waiting for my shift to end, pal. Every night. That's about as big as it gets.
Joe sighed, a deep, shuddering breath that felt like it brought him no relief.
No, not like that. More existential. Like the whole damn universe is holding its breath, and you're caught in its lungs.
He nursed his glass, the amber liquid offering no warmth tonight, no familiar comfort.
Arthur, down at the curio corner, he said something odd. Said we're there last?
Arthur's old. Says a lot of things. Probably had too much of his own special tea.
He said we're the last.
The young bartender scoffed, a short, dismissive sound that conveyed years of cynical indifference.
This town's full of folks like that. Seen too many nights, too many weirdos. What?
He gestured vaguely towards the street. Joe ignored him. He was used to being dismissed, to his words simply dissolving into the indifferent air of this unending twilight. He traced the rim of his glass with a trembling finger, the condensation cold against his skin.
To what? Been walking these same streets, seeing the same faces, the same crumbling brick, for I don't even know how long. Time here's a slippery thing, you see. It just blurs from 1 hour to the next, from one endless night to another, like a bad dream you can't quite wake from. It's like a record stuck in a groove, playing the same mournful tune forever.
He thought of the other perpetual residents of the town. The old woman who always sat by the bus stop on Plymouth Avenue, even though no buses ever seemed to come, her eyes fixed on some unseen horizon. The man who endlessly polished the chrome on a broken-down car in an alley off Main Street, never quite finishing, his movements as repetitive as a metronome. They were all part of this slow-motion tableau, existing within the perpetual twilight, their lives playing out in endless, subtle repetitions, each a solitary note in the city's ceaseless drone. He wondered if they too felt it. A sudden low groan rumbled through the bar, a sound that seemed to come not from the street, but from the very foundations of the building itself, deep beneath the cracked tile floor. The glasses on the shelf vibrated, a faint nervous chatter, and even the wilting rose tattooed on the bartender's arm seemed to ripple, as if the skin itself was reacting to an unseen pressure. The unsettling tremor passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind only an intensified silence. The young bartender, for the first time, looked genuinely unnerved. His bored expression was replaced by a flicker of raw fear, his gaze darting around the empty bar, then fixing on Joe.
What the hell was that?
Joe simply took a long, slow sip of his drink, the liquor now tasting like ash in his mouth. A strange, almost eager anticipation began to stir within him, an unfamiliar sensation in a life that had long been devoid of any true feeling, any genuine expectation. He set the empty glass down with a soft final clink.
Just the city, I suppose.
He said, his voice calmer than it had any right to be.
Or maybe, well, I don't know.
But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Joe felt a peculiar sense of something approaching. Not hope, not fear, but a quiet, profound certainty. He was close. He looked out the window, at the endless twilight of the city, and wondered. The silence that followed the tremor was heavier than any quiet Joe had ever known. It pressed in, thick and suffocating, amplifying every minute sound, the almost imperceptible drip of a leaky faucet somewhere in the back. The young bartender, his face pale and eyes wide, was no longer wiping glasses. He stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the swinging door to the kitchen, as if expecting something monstrous to emerge.
That wasn't the city clearing its throat. Something's not right.
Joe didn't respond immediately. He was listening, truly listening, for the first time in what felt like forever. The city, usually a symphony of muted, repetitive sounds, The distant clatter of a loose shutter, the faint groan of old pipes, the almost imperceptible drone of unseen machinery was unnaturally still. The familiar endless twilight outside the window seemed to have deepened. He pushed himself off the bar stool, the scraping of its legs against the floor echoing loudly in the sudden quiet. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were underwater, each step weighted with an unseen burden. He walked to the front window, his gaze sweeping over the deserted street. The flickering neon sign of the diner across the way, usually a comforting, if garish, beacon in the endless dusk, was now a harsh pulsing red, like a wounded eye staring back at him. The old woman who always sat by the bus stop, her perpetual vigil a strange comfort, was gone. The man who endlessly polished his broken-down car in the alley, his movements as repetitive as a metronome, was gone too. The street was empty, completely empty, save for the silent, looming buildings that seemed to lean in, watching.
It's quieter tonight.
Joe observed, a statement of fact rather than a question. He turned back to the bartender, a strange, knowing glint in his bloodshot eyes.
Don't you think?
The young bartender, finally snapping out of his stupor, hurried from behind the bar, his movements jerky and panicked, a desperate flight from the growing dread.
What are you talking about, Quieter? It's terrifying. We need to do something.
His words a futile attempt to cling to the rules of a world that was clearly not paying attention. Joe merely watched him, a faint smile on his lips, and a grim acknowledgement of the futility of it all.
And where exactly would you go, son?
He gestured vaguely to the street outside, then to the silent bar, to the empty bottles that reflected the dim light like vacant eyes.
There's nowhere to go.
A sound grew steadily louder, a rhythm that vibrated through the floorboards. The glass bottles behind the bar began to rattle, a chatter that mirrored the rapid beating of the young bartender's heart. This wasn't the distant rumble of a train or the groan of settling foundations. This was purposeful.
What is that sound? Oh God, what is that?
He was losing his composure, the fragile veneer of normalcy shattering. Joe, however, seemed to relax, a strange sense of calm settling over him. It was all leading somewhere. He had been waiting for this, he thought. He hadn't known it consciously, but he had been waiting for this. All the endless nights, the monotonous days, the conversations with himself, the bottomless bottles, and the burning cigarettes, they had been preparations. A long, drawn-out overture to a final inevitable act. He felt a peculiar sense of recognition, as if this moment had always been etched into his very being. He walked back to his usual stool, picking up his now truly empty glass. He held it up, examining it against the dim light, as if searching for answers in its vacant depths, or perhaps acknowledging a final silent toast.
It's here,
Joe said, a pronouncement delivered with solemn finality.
It's finally here.
The young bartender pressed himself against the back wall, eyes squeezed shut, hands clamped over his ears, as if trying to block out the invading sound, the terrifying truth that was now undeniable. He slid slowly to the floor, a heap of trembling limbs and defeated fear. But Joe was no longer listening to the sound alone. He was looking out the window again, not at the street, but upwards, towards the perpetually obscured sky. The twilight seemed to swirl and coalesce, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw it, an absence of light, a profound, consuming darkness that dwarfed the city below. A certainty settled over him, a calm born of resignation, a peace that came with the end of all waiting. There was no more guessing, no more wandering. The unspoken question that had haunted his every step was finally being answered. Joe murmured, taking one last long look at his reflection in the mirror, an image in the alcohol-stained glass, his own face of acceptance. He smiled, a bitter acknowledgement of the grand deception. The sound now was that of something unimaginably vast, finally stirring and moving. The preceding silence, which had felt like an eternity of holding one's breath, now revealed itself as merely the prelude to this cataclysmic plunge. The twilight outside the window, the perpetual state of this isolated town, deepened into an encroaching darkness. The faint glow of the distant neon sign, once a garish but comforting beacon, sputtered and died, plunging the street into blackness. A sudden cold seeped into Joe's bones, sharper and more profound than any winter night he had ever known. The young bartender, who had been whimpering just moments before, was now still. His face was pressed into the grimy floor, hands clamped over his ears, a pathetic heap of human terror. He had retreated completely, abandoning Joe to face the unfolding horror alone, a final poignant testament to the solitary nature of their collective demise. Joe, however, remained unfazed. He stood at the bar, his hand still resting on the empty glass, his gaze fixed on the window. It was not merely dark. It was a deeper, absorbing blackness that seemed to consume light, pulling it into its unfathomable depths. The bar itself began to shudder violently. A fine rain of dust sifted down from the ceiling, mingling with the pervasive sweet scent of stale beer and forgotten hopes that had clung to the establishment. The liquor bottles behind the bar began to crack. Then one by one they shattered. The mirrors, including the one that had served as Joe's confessor for so many lonely nights, dissolved into fragments. Joe remained motionless, his gaze still on the window. There was no escaping, no hiding.
Well then, it seems forever was just a warm-up act. Always knew it would come to this.
Joe offered. A smile, not of fear but of understanding, touched his lips. It was an acceptance, an acknowledgement of a debt finally being paid.
Always knew the house always wins.
He had lived a life of gambles, and now the ultimate wager was being called. He raised his empty glass one last time, a toast to the great final game, a final defiant gesture against the inevitable.
To the grand finale. May our exits be as spectacular as our entrances, and our hangovers eternal.
The glass began to crack in his hand. He didn't drop it. He held it firmly, watching as the crack spread. It was a final, fleeting connection to a world that was no more. Then, with a final, overwhelming surge, the glass in his hand disintegrated into dust, ceasing to exist as if it had never been. The bar groaned, the floor tilted, and then the world outside the window seemed to fold its hand. The street, the buildings, gone without a trace. Joe stood for a moment longer in the diminishing light, the bar dissolving around him. He felt no pain, no fear, only a strange, detached peace. He was merely observing, as he had always done, the final curtain call of existence. The great game was over, and the outcome that had been preordained from the very beginning. His eyes now clear and saw not darkness. It wasn't the end of a town or a world, but the end of seemingly everything he had ever known, everything that had ever been. A complete and orderly cessation of all reality and a return to that primordial nothingness. And then, just as his vision began to blur, just as the last trace of the bar and the world faded, a sharp, almost electrical jolt coursed through Joe. A sudden blinding white light that ripped through the nothingness, searing his eyes. He felt a sickening lurch, as if he were being pulled, rapidly and violently, from a deep sleep. He was no longer in the decaying bar. He was lying on a pristine, cold, smooth surface. Above him, he perceived a vast transparent dome, an impossibly curving ceiling that stretched high above, bathed in an artificial, utterly glow. Beyond the surface of the dome, indistinct figures in crisp, featureless white suits moved with a quiet, efficient precision. Their faces were obscured by the dome's refractive properties, or perhaps by their own visors, leaving only the chilling impression of detached observation. A calm, dispassionate voice, perfectly modulated, broke the silence. It was perfect, devoid of inflection, a voice that spoke as if stating a mathematical proof. But it was not speaking to him.
Subject 734 Alpha simulation complete. Final existential decay observed as predicted. Replicability confirmed across parameters.
Another voice replied, equally crisp and devoid of emotion, closer this time, as if from a speaker directly above him.
Terminate environmental stressors. Begin debriefing on perpetual twilight psychological effects and societal collapse triggers. Instigate anon.
Joe's eyes, wide and unfocused, stared up at the dome. He tried to speak, but no sound emerged. His throat felt dry, his body strangely heavy. The bitter cocktail of stale beer and forgotten hopes that had clung to his soul for what felt like an eternity was gone, replaced by the antiseptic scent of a clean room. The twilight, the endless night, oblivion, all of it had been a meticulously crafted stage, a crucible for observation. He was not the last man on Earth. He was simply a number, a data point in an experiment whose purpose he could only now begin to dimly grasp. The true horror was the realization that his entire existence, his very despair, had been nothing more than a controlled variable in a grand, impersonal design. The house hadn't just one. Joe's hand was always to fold. As the stark light illuminates the true nature of Joe's agonizing reality, we are left with a chilling revelation. His endless nights, his desperate ramblings, his very despair, all carefully orchestrated, meticulously observed. The last man on Earth was merely a character in a grim play, the crumbling world his stage. In the vast, silent theaters of the universe, where the curtains are drawn back on existence itself, there are no audiences, only analysts. And for those who orchestrate the grandest of experiments, the human spirit, in all its fragile, enduring agony, is but a variable in a cold, unfeeling equation. The ultimate truth of it all isn't grand, isn't a sweeping journey, nor a testament to divine grace, but something far more singular, a mere lonely data point, adrift in a cosmic sea. A pellucid entry into a cold, unassuming archive, meticulously catalogued by of what dreams cannot state. An utterly detached entity whose purpose we can't begin to fathom. Thus we must acknowledge that the universe isn't of comforting myth or inspiring epic. It's a place insufferably clinical, cruelly indifferent, and vastly more than anything dared to conceive. We stand here, tethered from inception to death, to our limited understanding, yearning of what is yet to come. We long to see, yet perception, that paradoxical grift, both defines and confines our reality. What desolate truths, what profound and unsettling realities lie just out of reach, pressing against the very edges of our awareness, forever hidden from our grasp. But perhaps the defining silence, that answers, is perhaps the most terrifying truth of all, a macabre confirmation that, in this vast, indifferent expanse, we are merely whispers of our own relativity, echoing into an unfeeling void.